Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood, and you're watching Evolution Lecture 1. This is the first lecture of the Evolution and Population Genetics unit. Basically, this unit is going to split into two lectures on evolution, and then the third and final lecture for the unit will be covering population genetics. So, before we get into any kind of discussion on this unit, I'd like to have a very serious talk with everyone that's watching. I want to make it very, very clear from the very beginning here that this discussion is not meant to persuade you into changing what you may believe about the history of the earth and origins of life and how things have developed to be what we see today. The purpose of this unit is for you to understand the scientific viewpoint of how things have developed up to this point. So a lot of people in this unit tend to have certain degrees of discomfort because their own beliefs, their own personal beliefs, may contradict some of the things that we're going to be discussing in some of these lectures. And again, I want it to be clear that it's perfectly okay for you to believe in something that's a little different than what you may be hearing in the explanations that we talk about here. There is a place for a religious discussion, but that place is not in a science classroom. That's definitely something that can be discussed in maybe your English classes when you're reading different novels, in your world geography classes when you're hearing about the different cultures of the world, maybe in your world history courses and things like that. There's definitely a place for a religious discussion, but in a science classroom, we can only discuss what's scientifically supported. And so we will only be discussing evolutionary theory, which again, the term theory is not just a random idea. As you're going to see in the second lecture, there's a significant amount of evidence supporting the scientific discussions that we'll be going over here in this unit. But again, at no point am I trying to convince you one way or the other. All I ask is that you have a deep understanding of the scientific side of this argument. Okay, so we're going to go over the theory of evolution and all of its scientific components. And again, all I ask is that you be respectful of this concept as I would be respectful of anyone's own personal beliefs if they were possibly to disagree with some of these ideas in the classroom. Okay, so that being said, hopefully everybody can calm their nerves a little bit if they were a little bit tense about hearing about this idea. And if your parents are at all uncomfortable with this concept, I ask that you have them sit down and watch these exact same videos. Alright, so that being said, we're going to get into the concept of evolution. This first lecture is going to focus on the overall theory of evolution, and particularly on Darwin's 5 points, which are basic components surrounding the concept of natural selection, which later became known as evolution. In this lecture, we're going to first get into some basic background of some scientific theorists and some strong scientific ideas that were developing around the time that Darwin was putting his own thoughts and ideas together. We'll discuss Charles Darwin specifically, a little bit of background and history on him, as well as some discussion of his voyage as a naturalist on a ship that gave him a lot of the data, the content data that he used to develop his theory. And then we're going to get right into it and talk about those actual 5 points to discuss Darwin's basic idea of natural selection and his concept of how species have changed over time. So let's get started by talking about some basic evolutionary scientists that were putting things together around the time of Charles Darwin. The first one we're going to talk about is named James Hutton. James Hutton is considered the father of geology. He did a lot of research on the basic earth and rocks and developed a lot of the background that is built into the idea of geology today. The biggest contribution, really, if we can think about one basic thing that he did in terms of how it affects Darwin's theory, is he focused a lot on the age of the earth based on measurements and data he was doing in terms of the rock samples that he was collecting. At this time, and very possibly still today, a very common belief is that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, and that everything that's ever occurred on Earth occurred within those few thousand years. Hutton was the first to really come up with support and data suggesting that that is not necessarily the case, that the age of the Earth could be significantly larger than that, and what we see today may not necessarily be what was around when maybe the Earth was first developed and had first signs of life on it. So this was a major change in common idea, because even in the scientific community it was pretty well agreed at this point, right around the mid-1700s and late 1700s, that the Earth was relatively young, even in the scientific field. So he was the first to really come up with the idea that that may not necessarily be true, and a lot of scientists really started to fall in line with this basic idea. The second scientist is going to be very influential, as will the third, to specifically relating to Charles Darwin. This scientist is named Charles Lyell. Lyell was someone who actually met and spoke with Charles Darwin in his development of his overall concept of natural selection. Lyell is sort of a supporter of Hutton and kind of built on Hutton's idea, specifically focusing in on the idea of how the Earth has changed over the time when it's been developed. And he focused in a lot about how geological changes due to what we now know as tectonic plate and shift movement, and relating to things like earthquakes and volcanoes and all the shifts of the Earth, had significant contributions in how things have changed in the Earth's history. And again, a lot of his discussions one-on-one with Charles Darwin contributed a lot to Darwin's overall theory. The third scientist is actually an economist. His name is Thomas Malthus, and you'll probably hear about him if you haven't already in your world geography classes and some other world history, because he had a lot of very strong opinions and certain controversial ideas of how population and population size can be controlled and is naturally controlled. We'll talk more about Thomas Malthus as we focus in on one of Darwin's 5 points, but his basic principle is that certain things that we may naturally consider as just horrible things when you hear them, things like disease, famine, people starving, and war and things like that, may actually have a use or a benefit in the overall population in terms of controlling the numbers of the overall population. Kind of a dark way to think about populations, but it's something that Darwin considered very deeply in his overall development of his natural selection theory. So all of these scientists played different roles in terms of the contributions. The last two especially played significant roles directly on Darwin's overall concept, but of course it based it on the idea that Hutton suggested, that the Earth is significantly older than we think, because as we're going to discuss here, the concept of natural selection requires a significant amount of time. Immense amounts of time have to be available in order for the evolutionary theory to really occur, because as we're going to see, a lot of these things happen over quite a bit of time. So all these scientists played major roles. Now let's talk about Darwin himself. Charles Darwin was a privileged child. He was born into a family that was very wealthy. His father was a prominent doctor in England. He went to follow in his footsteps. That he did very well in school, and as he went into university, he went to the best medical university at the time, and he followed in his father's footsteps. He did some apprenticeship where he was in surgery with his father, and he did a lot of job shadowing and things like that. He was right in line and on pace to be a very good medical doctor, but what he was realizing was in college he was focusing a significant amount of his time and his interest outside of the medical field and into some of the more natural history, some of the idea of the different specimens of life on Earth, and focusing in on the Earth structure as well, not so much on the human being or the body. And this upset his father very much, because of course his father wanted him to follow his footsteps. So he pulled Darwin out of this medical university and put him into another university to study theology. So Darwin was actually in line to become some component within a religious aspect. However, even in those colleges as well, he started focusing significantly on the idea of natural history and the development of the Earth and the creatures that are living on this Earth. So he always kind of had this tendency to pull away from the ideas of medicine or theology and really focus in on what's considered naturalism, or the development of the Earth, and really understanding the scientific support of that idea. And little by little, he started meeting certain crowds of scientists, and those scientists finally encouraged him to go on to this ship this voyage, and the ship was called the HMS Beagle. It's very important you remember. The HMS Beagle is the name of the ship. It was responsible for doing a number of significant things in terms of understanding the world around it. It circumnavigated the globe. It went all the way around the world, and in doing so, it stopped multiple times to collect data about a number of different things, and there were multiple categories of scientists on this ship doing their job. Some focused on the ocean, some focused on the climate, some focused on the geology. Darwin's job was as a naturalist, which means he was responsible for observing and recording and taking samples of as much life as he possibly could at each of these individual stopping points, whether that life was plant, animal, whatever. His job was to just take it all in and record as much as he possibly could. And what is really unique about his voyage, he was only 22 at the time, he was young, he didn't like ships, he got seasick quite a bit. It's very well known that he got seasick quite often over the course of this 5-year voyage, but he really just took a lot in. And what we started noticing was really significant was not the fact that there's a lot of diversity of life and a lot of very unique creatures and things like that, but he started recognizing that at each point in the voyage, he'd find distinctly unique organisms, and organisms that were significantly different than some of the organisms that he'd find on similar climates in other parts of the world. So he really started recognizing that even though the environmental conditions are very similar, the types of life that are in these different places are so drastically different, and it started to get his mind churning over the idea, because again, he was in the theological study for quite a while, and to the idea of, if this is something that is placed for the success in that environment, why are two organisms in very similar environments so drastically different and still have their own unique ways of being successful? And all of these ideas started to churn into his head in terms of what he was recording. So he just kept recording data the whole way through. A lot of the data was stuff outside of his fields of expertise, so he was pretty much just getting samples so that when he did go back, he could get other experts to start researching and tell them what they knew about his findings. So he went around the whole world. Then one specific area that became a very big component of his overall theory was a series of islands that were off of the coast of Ecuador, still are, off of the coast of Ecuador, called the Galapagos Islands. What's unique about the Galapagos Islands is that they're basically uninhabited by man, at that time at least, which meant that other life forms had free range to really develop on these islands without any sort of human interference. And in doing so, he was really able to find some very unique observations along the way as he went from island to island, noticing very unique types of organisms, variations of unique types of organisms in different islands, and how certain traits were found on certain islands, and it's those traits that made them successful because the islands were slightly different from each other. A lot of very subtle differences from island to island in terms of the organisms that he found contributed to what became his overall concept of natural selection. So again, this is a 5-year voyage, and he was 22 when he started. So by the time he arrived back in England, he was 27. Now, he spent a great deal of time researching and analyzing all of his data and having other specialists come in and take a look, and speaking with other scientists like Charles Lyell and things like that, and contributing all of the different ideas, reading Malthus's Principles of Population. All of these different things contributed together. And it wasn't until he was 60 years old, which means he went 33 years before publishing all of his overall findings and his overall theory, when he put together what's often considered in the scientific community as one of the most important and most influential publications in history. And that is what we call On the Origin of Species. So this was the publication that was given out by Charles Darwin that deeply discussed his overall concepts of natural selection. And his overall concept can basically be broken down into what we consider his 5 points. So we're going to go over those 5 points now. The first of the 5 points is that organisms produce more offspring than can survive. This is based almost entirely on Thomas Malthus's theory. So here's the idea, and here's the premise. In all life, including human life, especially in the 1800s, not every offspring is going to survive. We have major medical advances now that make it a much, much more probable scenario that if you have a child, that child will survive. We have a lot of modern medicine, a lot of technology to help us ensure that. But especially in Darwin's time, it was very common that a child may not survive. And so even in those times, even with human species, all organisms produce more offspring than will survive. And especially when we're talking about certain species, if there's a very high chance that offspring won't survive, they've developed the ability to produce a significant number of offspring at a time. And a perfect example are these giant sea turtles. All the different species within this family of giant sea turtles have something in common. They produce a high number of eggs when they do lay their eggs. And they usually, they're called sea turtles, right? So they're in the oceans and the seas. They typically find a beach, they get onto a beach, and they lay their eggs on that beach. But the problem is, it's become pretty commonplace, and a lot of the natural predators of the sea turtles are aware of this and will try to find these hatchlings. And these sea turtles aren't quite like human beings in terms of how they care for their young. They work, of course, very hard within their body to allow the development of the eggs, but once they lay the eggs, they swim away and are likely to never see their hatchlings again. So that means those hatchlings, those eggs, are completely on their own. So by the time they do actually develop in the egg and they crack out of their shell, it's all on them. They have the responsibility of first having the coordination to be able to know which way is the ocean, because if you can't get to the ocean, you won't survive. And they have to worry about all these predators that could be coming in the way to pick them out as they go in their very vulnerable situation, not only into the ocean, but once they're in the ocean, there are natural predators there as well. So these sea turtles produce typically about 100 eggs at a time. And of those 100 eggs, it's common that on average only about 1% of those 100 eggs will tend to survive. So we're talking about just 1 or 2 eggs out of 100 that will actually survive to maturity and to adulthood. So with those kinds of odds, if you imagine only 5 eggs being hatched or something like that, there's a very good chance that the species wouldn't make it to the next generation. You're not having enough surviving to the point where they can actually produce their own offspring that the species can continue. So over time, these different species have developed the ability of making many, many babies. Now, this concept of making many, many babies presents a problem, because with many, many babies comes many, many stomachs and the need for food and other resources, and that kind of a need causes a problem, because there's not enough of these resources to necessarily allow them all to get what they need, or in terms of being able to avoid predators or have a natural compass, basically, and be able to quickly find the water and move in the right direction. Not all of them are going to be able to do what they need to do. And this problem is what Malthus discusses in the human population. If every single human that was born survived and was successful and was plentiful, then we would very much run out of resources. And if we have a very severe limit of these resources, it's just basic math. There's not enough of these resources to feed and allow the survival for all of the people that survive. So even though we think of things like war and famine and disease as horrible things, they are what Malthus considers as natural checks and balances of the human population. That with that loss in the human population, the overall species can keep itself within a certain range of the resources that are available to them to be fairly successful, still have resources available to them, and not completely wear out everything that's available. So it's kind of a dark idea, again, but it's something that Darwin really pulled into his overall concept of natural selection. So the first idea is that all organisms produce as many offspring as they can to survive, and basically that leads to the problem of overpopulation. So the first concept, there's overpopulation in just about every species. So a way to break it down, this first point basically says that there is an overpopulation of just about every species on Earth. Alright, so the second point in Darwin's theory suggests that all species have genetic variation. This means that within a species, we're not all the same. And we've talked about this in previous units, why that's important, why that actually occurs. It's due to 2 things happening. One is mutations, like you see there on the right, and the other is due to crossing over of meiosis, which you see there in the picture in the middle. We've talked about both of these concepts in depth before, so there's no need to go into a whole lot of detail about this. But basically, we are unique from each other because, 1, traits are introduced in populations due to typically a mutation that happened in the DNA. That mutation in the DNA can create unique proteins. Those unique proteins can now allow for a cell to do something different, or a whole organism, because of all of the cells with the mutation, to do something different. And we said before, mutations are not always bad. It's not always a deformity. It's not always something that's going to cause a disease or cancer or things like that. Sometimes it can actually give you a trait that someone else doesn't have that could give you an advantage. So a lot of times when we talk about this developmental change and evolutionary change, it's usually something that started with a simple mutation that introduced a trait that wasn't present before in a population. So this unique introduction of a trait is often due to a mutation. And then within an overall species, we've talked about how important it is that your gametes are all unique from each other, because slightly unique gametes means slightly unique offspring. If all of us were exactly the same, 100% identical, and our gametes were produced in a very similar way to mitosis, there was no crossing over, everybody was exactly the same because we were all formed from the same gametes, one, we'd all be the same gender, which would pretty much kill our species within a generation. But outside of that idea, we'd all be exactly the same. We'd all have an equal opportunity for every chance of survival and gaining of our resources. But that's not the case. Every one of us is slightly unique. We have slightly unique traits because of certain mutations that happen within our genetic line, and because of the crossing over that occurred in every one of our gametes, especially in the two gametes that combine to make you. We all have very unique properties. Even though we're all part of the same species, we all have the human DNA line, which means we have the ability of making all of the human proteins that are available. We don't make the exact same proteins. We pull from slightly unique parts. We have slightly unique inheritance patterns because of genetics, and it makes us very, very special, very, very unique. So it's very important you understand here. There's overpopulation in just about every species, and within that species, not everyone is the same. Organisms have slightly unique characteristics and variations that give them certain abilities and disabilities. So understanding those two, we take it into the third concept, or the third point of Darwin's 5 points, which is basically competition. All organisms have to compete for these resources that are not necessarily always abundant for every single living thing. There are 4 basic resources that we discuss when we talk about these limiting factors. The 4 limiting factors are food, water, shelter, and space. You probably would have guessed food and water as things you need to survive. All living things have to have some form of food and water in order to survive. Whether or not they make their own food, like photosynthetic organisms or not, doesn't really matter in this case. They all have to be able to provide themselves with sustenance. One of the 8 characteristics of life is to be able to make your own food through metabolism. So all living things have to be able to gain an access to their food source. They all need water. Every organism, because of the cellular structure, is made almost entirely of water, so you have to always gain access to that water in order to keep the cells functioning. The shelter and space things are something we typically think about for much more complex organisms like animals, plants, things like that. Shelter from weather, from predators, from all different scenarios of threats to their lives are very important, and there's typically only so much shelter with any given space or area. And then space just in general, just the amount of area within a given place is also limiting. So when we talk about populations hitting what we're going to talk about as the carrying capacity or the limit of some of these factors, things are going to get a little dicey, because if your population is under this carrying capacity, which is the highest a population can be when still having all of its limiting resources available. Once it hits that carrying capacity, we're now to the point where not all organisms are necessarily going to get what they need. And this is a very basic principle of natural selection that you have to understand. So let's make an analogy here. Let's think about it this way. Let's say that I was trapped in a room with 20 other people for 6 months, and there was no way of getting out for whatever reason you want to make up. Okay? If I was trapped in a room for 6 months, no way out, with 20 people, if there was enough food and water and all of the resources available for 50 people to survive for 6 months, then I wouldn't have any problem, right? Regardless of how successful I was at doing anything, I would have access to all of my resources, and I would still get whatever I needed. Even if I was the last one to get it every single time, I'm still getting what I need. I still can keep myself alive. Everything is fine because the resources are plentiful. I'm below the carrying capacity for that room. As long as we're all below the carrying capacity, all the resources are there, and regardless of who's more successful at getting the resources, all of us get what we need and we're all fine. However, let's change the scenario a little bit. Now let's say it's the same scenario, 20 people trapped in a room for 6 months, but now there's only enough resources available for about 10 people to survive in that time period. If only about half of the population is going to survive the 6 months because of the resources that are available, now we're going to be in trouble. And this is where the competition comes into play. So the idea of competition for resources only exists if there are fewer resources than there is a given population for the species. Only when we're limited in the resources does the real competition for survival have to occur. So if we're in this position now where there's only enough food for 10 of us, and there are 20 of us now in the room trying to survive, something's going to give. Something's got to give. 10 of us will not make it. And because of that, the characteristics that we each have that make us unique are going to really start showing. And those that have very certain skills or certain traits that make us more successful at getting the food, let's say the food is stuck to the walls or stuck to the ceilings, so only the tallest of us or the most agile are the ones that are going to get the resources that we need, whatever scenario you want to think about there. The certain traits that will give us a better chance at getting our resources are the ones that are going to give us a better chance at survival. And this is a concept that's become known as survival of the fittest, which is Darwin's fourth point. Now, he actually never coined this phrase. He didn't use this phrase. This phrase was used later by another scientist, and it got kind of connected to Darwin's theory. He used the terms natural selection. He referred to the term natural selection because he, before finally publishing On the Origin of Species, talked about something called artificial selection, which is basically like breeding, selective breeding, when people are trying to breed for certain traits in different species of organisms, like plants or certain breeds of dogs or horses or things like that. When they're trying to find certain traits and trying to only pull parents that have certain traits together, that's what he considers artificial selection, because he's making it much more likely for certain traits to show up in the next generation, but he's doing it on his own. So in this discussion, because it's not something that individuals are doing to give groups a better chance at survival, it's just the natural flow of what he's discussing in terms of this these 5 points, he used the term natural selection sort of as an analogy or a comparison to his artificial selection. So anyway, he calls this natural selection, but we think of it also as survival of the fittest. It's the idea where those who have the highest fitness for a given environment, those who are most fit for a given environment, are the ones that are most successful. And because they're most successful, they're more likely to survive. The other ones that are less successful are more likely not to survive. So that means only the 10 that are the most fit in the room out of the 20 will be the ones that are still standing when the 6 months is out. Now, when I say the word fitness to you guys, you probably think of something like this, right? Someone who's very muscular, very active, and what you think of in modern society as someone who's very healthy or fit. When in reality, fitness could very well be something like this. It all depends on the environment. Let's say the environment was very cold and there was very little resource of food available, which means not only did you have to be able to insulate your own body and keep yourself warm, but you had to be able to basically pull from your own storages of energy, because you're not going to be getting as much energy from your diet. In that situation, the second picture here, what you see at the bottom, this guy's definitely more fit for that environment than the first one. The first one probably wouldn't last very long because he doesn't have a whole lot of body fat, which means he can't pull a lot of energy from his own body, and the insulation's not really there either. Muscle doesn't really keep temperature controlled nearly as well as body fat. So the first guy would probably die off pretty quickly. So it depends on the environment when we talk about fitness. Fitness is just the ability to survive within a given environment. So someone who has a high fitness for a given environment means they have certain characteristics that make them more successful in that environment in terms of gaining access to those limiting resources. So if someone has a high fitness, then they will survive. If someone doesn't have a high fitness, then they won't. So the basic premise here are within the group and within a population, within a period of time, the ones that are most successful will survive through the end of that time frame, and the ones that are least successful will not survive, which means they're either going to die out or perhaps they'll move somewhere else and go to another area where maybe they're more successful. One way or another, the group that's left in that population, what we consider the gene pool, now on average all have those traits that make them more successful for that environment. So then the next generation is going to see kind of the same progression. So this deals with the idea of adaptation, the idea that species adapt over time, which is basically concepts of evolution. Species change over time is the basic definition of evolution. But the word adaptation is often used incorrectly in common English language. When we think about adapting to something, it usually means you become aware of the need to change, and therefore you change yourself to fit within that environment and make you more successful, right? You guys coming into your 9th grade year probably recognized a lot of changes that needed to happen in terms of your academic success for the classroom. So because you realized some things needed to change, you changed yourself to become successful. That's how you commonly use the word adaptation. But the scientific term, the scientific definition is the exact opposite. If you use the word adaptation correctly, especially here in the idea of evolutionary theory, an adaptation is not the idea of a conscious recognition of a need to change, but it's a natural change that already occurred that gives you an advantage without your conscious thought. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say that I was born with little tiny slits in my neck. I had little tiny gills, basically. Those of you that don't know, gills allow for gas diffusion in water. So fish and other ocean life survive underwater because their gills are able to transfer and diffuse the oxygen that we typically do in the air. So being born with gills, as you I'm sure would be able to imagine, is not necessarily going to win me a lot of popularity contests, right? I probably have a very difficult time making friends, probably get ridiculed a lot and things like that. So in this environment, being born with gills, with a mutation like this of having gills in the human body, being born with this mutation would not necessarily give me any kind of an advantage. In fact, it's probably a slight disadvantage when we're thinking about getting older and finding a mate and things like that. But let's say that years later there was a massive flood and it rained for multiple continuous days, and just massive amounts of water came on the earth, and that caused every bit of land on earth to be submerged in hundreds of feet of water. All right? Now, who do you think has the advantage? The freak with the gills, right? Exactly. Because I already had these gills, I already had this natural ability to survive underwater, I am now in a position where I have a much better chance of gaining my resources than anyone else in the human population. So because of my natural mutation, I am adapted to this new environment. So I have the adaptation that allows me to survive in the new environment. I didn't create the adaptation. I didn't decide to get the adaptation. People around me didn't just start slicing their neck and hoping for the best, thinking that they'd survive with gills, right? It doesn't work like that. You had to actually be born with these natural slits in the tissue that give me the ability to diffuse gases through water. And because I was born with it, I am now successful in this new environment. So that's the idea of an adaptation. The mutation must already exist. So that's very important. With an adaptation, if you use it the scientific way, the trait or the mutation must already exist before the environmental change. And then with an environmental change, that trait makes that organism adapted to the new environment. So in the scenario down here, because the lower gentleman has a significant amount of body fat, he had the natural adaptation for a very cold and a low food environment. He was more successful there because of his natural structure and the way his body was already prepared for that particular environmental change. Whereas the first guy didn't necessarily have what he needed to survive. He was not adapted to the environment, and therefore he did not survive. This idea of natural progression and change over time is something that was already around in Darwin's time. There was another very, very big scientific theory in relation to how species change that was developed by a scientist called Lamarck. Now, Lamarck is a French scientist. His basic idea was that change over time occurred because of each individual generation's effort. And basically, here's the scenario. We'll use giraffes as an example. You guys know giraffes have very long necks, right? They didn't used to have as long of necks as they have today. The species and the origins of the giraffe species didn't have those long necks that are around today. They were much shorter. And Lamarck's explanation for why giraffes' necks have gotten significantly longer is because in each generation, each giraffe would stretch its neck out, purposely stretching its neck out almost every day to try to reach its higher levels of the canopies of trees to get to leaves. Because each individual generation of giraffe constantly stretched their necks, the next generation of giraffes had slightly longer necks because of it. Because of the effort that that generation did in stretching their own necks, it was passed on to the next generation. That was Lamarck's idea. Now, I hope you guys understand, with your understanding of genetics, that it doesn't really work like that. For example, if I didn't like my nose, I thought my nose was too round and bulbous or whatever, and I decided I want a nose job. And I go get a nose job. Okay? Some little thin, tiny nose, right? Brad Pitt nose or something like that. And then I decide to have children. Are my children going to get my nose job? I hope you know that's not correct, right? That's a crazy concept. It's ridiculous. Of course they're not going to get your nose job, because your nose job is not in your genetic line. It's not in your DNA. It's not passed on in your gametes, right? Coincidentally, you see a lot of these Hollywood celebrities having children. A lot of times the children aren't really that good looking, right? So it tells you a lot about maybe the amount of work that each of those parents have had done on themselves, right? Because you get your own genetic information passed on to you. You don't get any sort of manipulation that you did within your own lifetime passed on, unless that manipulation is done genetically, which is definitely a whole other issue. We're nowhere near that. So it's a very important concept here. Lamarck's idea was that each individual species, because at each generation they worked to create certain traits, those traits were passed on. That's something that has a very distinct imperfection, because as I hope you understand, this is the idea of what's called acquired characteristics. You acquire something in your own lifetime. You gain it in your own lifetime, not genetically, but through other resources. So Lamarck's idea was that acquired characteristics could be passed on, which we know to be incorrect, whereas Darwin's theory is all based on genetics. Darwin's suggestion is that hereditary information is passed on from one generation to the next, which we do know to be absolutely true. It's only a trait that's due to a change in your DNA, due to a mutation, due to crossing over, due to anything of that factor, that can actually be put into your gametes and passed on. So only if certain traits are genetically passed on to the next generation will they have those traits. So basically, going back to the giraffe idea, Darwin's idea is not that each giraffe stretched its neck out to make themselves longer, and that's why the next generation naturally had longer necks. Darwin's suggestion was that of the overall population, they had varying lengths of necks, some longer necks, some shorter necks, but they all fought for the same resources, which were leaves that were high up in the canopy of trees, where there was less competition. So naturally, in each generation, the ones that already have the longer necks get the food more often, and they're more successful in survival. The ones with the shorter necks maybe survive less, don't survive long enough to produce any offspring. So by the time the next generation comes around, maybe on average, more of the longer neck giraffes are the ones having offspring, and the shorter neck giraffes are tending to die off. And so if you keep this pattern over multiple generations, over a significant amount of time, the species of giraffe will all have gradually longer necks. They're the ones that are naturally more successful in their environment, and every generation they're the ones that are surviving more often. That's the evolutionary concept. That's the natural selection discussion of how adaptations evolve. The long neck adaptation is something that certain groups in the giraffe population already had, and therefore gave them more success in their competition. They were the more fit, and they're the ones that survive. So Darwin's fifth and final point is what we consider descent with modifications. Basically a conclusionary statement that just says that over time, species change. And with that change, the more successful traits are the ones that are prevalent and show more often. The less successful traits are the ones that tend to die off, until, in theory, all of a given population now have the trait that is giving them the success in that environment. And until there's some sort of an environmental change, that'll continue to happen. And then with a new environmental change, there could be a new trait that is now the more successful, and we can continue to see shifts and change over significant periods of time. That's basically it. That's what we consider Darwin's 5 points in his overall theory of natural selection. And it can all be kind of summarized straight from The Origin of Species, his actual publication, his book. This is taken from the introduction word for word. And let's read through it carefully. This is Darwin's words on his overall theory of natural selection. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Now, I know some of these words are a little more complex, but these are Darwin's 5 points, laid out in his own words. There are too many organisms born in a population. There's overpopulation occurring. He went straight to the third idea. They have to fight for the resources that are limiting. An overpopulated group is not all going to survive. And then because within a population there's variety, they're not all the same in terms of their competition, some will be more successful than others. And those who are more successful and naturally more capable are the ones that will gain the resources they need. And then over time, there will be descent with modification. Over time, the more successful traits are the ones that are getting passed on, the less successful traits are the ones that are dying off, and we're now left with a group, an overall species, that has the fit traits and that are adapted for the environment in order to allow them to be successful. So this is the basic concept of how species evolve and change over time. The more successful ones are the ones that pass on and continue in their fight for life and their struggle for survival. The less successful ones are the ones that slowly start to die out. Now that leads to the question, what happens if within a species an environmental change occurs that's so drastic that there are no groups in that population, or at least there aren't large enough groups in the population that have the natural adaptations to survive? What happens to that species? That's where the idea of extinction comes in. When species can no longer survive in an environment, and there are no natural adaptations found in their genetic pool, in their gene pool, that gives certain groups any kind of chance of survival in that new environment, no species will make it long enough to be able to reproduce, or at least over the course of multiple generations. There will eventually come a point where the populations are not surviving long enough to make more offspring. And that means, in that scenario, unless something drastic happens, that species is gone. And that's the idea of extinction. Because of their lack of fitness in an environment, they will not be able to propagate or continue to produce offspring in the next generation. So extinction is what basically happens in Darwin's theory to those who do not naturally have the fitness and the adaptations necessary to survive. And as we're going to start talking about in the next lecture, there are very unique characteristics that suggest that this all started with very simple organisms, and then little by little, mutation after mutation, introduction of new trait after new trait, and slight changes in environmental conditions all throughout the world, little changes developed into new species, and new species developed into more new species, and you started creating this variety of life that you see today. And we're going to talk about that in the second lecture, based entirely off of this principle of Darwin's natural selection. All right, that's it for this time. I'll see you next time.